Hello and welcome to the introduction to the xamPivotGrid. And in this video what I'd like to do is get you acquainted with what's necessary in order to set up the pivot grid to use an XMLA data source in order to read out of the AdventureWorks database to provide data for the grid. So here's what the pivot grid looks like bound up to the orders and the cities by date within the AdventureWorks database. Now setting up something even seemingly as simple as this is not trivial as far as the initial setups that's required for your server. And so what I like to do is take you through the steps that are required in order to have your environment set up before you get to writing any code. So the place you want to start is up on our community site. There's a blog post written by Atanas Dayulgarov that goes through all the steps that you need in order to set up SQL Server Analysis Services, to customize IIS, and also install AdventureWorks on your system. And so once you have these pieces set up, then you can get to the point to where you're working with the control. But first I want to take you through what Atanas has available on his blog post. So typing in that tiny URL will bring you to this post. And what he's first going to do is take you through from the very first steps of installing SQL Server Analysis Services and give you each one of the details that you need in order to make sure it's installed correctly. Because you need SQL Server Analysis Services set up on your machine, you need IIS configured correctly in order to run the DLL that Analysis Services will use to talk to a data warehouse, and you'll also, at least for this example, install AdventureWorks so you have some sample data to work with. So once you start going through the installation process, then you'll define an instance for your database. He'll give you all the details you need to make sure that it's configured and the security is set up correctly. And even a reminder that you need to make sure you install Service Pack 1, even though the installer will do that for you, it's documented here as well. Once you get everything set up correctly, there's a way to test to make sure the analysis services is set up correct on your machine. And then you'll turn your attention to IIS. So once you go into the area where you turn on and off settings for Windows, following these checkboxes will give you all the details you need to make sure that you have IIS and the other components set up on the machine correctly. And then next you'll add an application pool and then also create a new application that application pool will use. And then finally add a mapping handler to make sure that you can run that DLL based off of an HTTP request. And the last part of it here, he gives you a way to test to make sure that you have all that set up correctly. And then finally the steps that you need in order to install the AdventureWorks database. And he's even conscientious enough to know that there's a couple different ways you might want to set up security. And so if you want to use iUser to access the data warehouse, you can do that. So all of the details and the information obviously are on this post that you're looking at. And so go through all of those steps in detail, and then once you get down to the point where it says Infragistics Pivot Grid Demo, there's where you want to stop, because the rest of his post deals with syntax and an object model that's based off the pre-release version of these controls. And so assuming you have all of that set up correctly, now let's take a look at the application and see actually how easy it is to start dealing with the data warehouse and our pivot grid. So here we are in Visual Studio, and as we usually start off, let's review some of the required namespaces that you'll need. We'll have igPivot that points to infragistics.controls.grids, and then XMLA, which points to infragistics.olap.xmla. Now bringing in the XMLA namespace will give you access to the XMLA data source. And so the key that we're just giving it here is pivot grid data source. And the server URI, if you set up everything according to Atanas' article, you'll be able to access the localhost /olap/msmdpump.dll, going after the AdventureWorks database and the AdventureWorks cube. And we're pulling in the rows of customer and city in the columns of date and calendar. And for the measures, we're looking at order count. So that sets up the data source within the page. And then getting the grid to display the data that's prepared by the data source is as simple as setting the data source property within the grid to pivot grid data source. So now when we run this, we should get something that looks a lot like with what we started with. So here's the grid as it's first rendered, and then I can expand these items here for cities and periods and even begin to drill down even further into the hierarchy. And that's getting started with the xamPivotGrid.
Infragistics. on the web at infragistics.com.